Hi, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation about a thoroughly remarkable work in a thoroughly remarkable edition of the IMPAKT Festival. My name is Mihnea Mircan and I'm a curator based in Bucharest, Romania. And I want to thank IMPAKT for their hospitality and to congratulate curators Eric Bunger and Florian Wust for their splendid achievement, as well as to thank them for the invitation to think through the set of theoretical and visual propositions articulated, interwoven in the video constant, which most of you have hopefully seen in the exhibition with filmmakers Beny, Wagner and Sasha Litvintseva and media theorist Holl. Beny Wagner and Sasha Litvintseva are artists, filmmakers, researchers, and writers working collaboratively since 2018. They are the 2022 European Media Art Platform resident artists at the Center for Media Culture of the IMPAKT Festival. Focusing on the moving image as a tool for the active production of new worlds, Beny and Sasha's practice has been driven by questions around the thresholds between the body and its surroundings, knowledge regimes and power, modes of organizing and perceiving the natural world. Their work has been exhibited internationally, including screenings at film festivals in Berlin, Rotterdam, Copenhagen, Ghent, and Lisbon, and exhibitions at venues such as the CEC Vilnius, Los Angeles Film Forum, Museum of the Moving Image in New York, and Transmediale. Holl is professor for media studies and media aesthetics at Basel University. Her research focuses on the media history of perception and on the epistemology of the audiovisual. She has published widely on film and cinema, as well as on the media history of acoustics and electroacoustics. Among those books, too few of which have been translated into English, as far as I can tell, I will only mention Cinema, Trance, and Cybernetics, as well as the Moses Complex, Freud, Schoenberg, Strobuet. Ute makes documentary, experimental, and feature films, her most recent project being Amitié with Peter Ott, which will be released next year by Real Fiction. In 2000, Ute was the curator of the exhibition Search Images at Kunstwerke in Berlin, together with Friedrich Kittler, Wolfgang Ernst, Harun Farocki, and Stefan Heidenreich. As I mentioned, our talk takes as point of departure the film Constant, fragments of which will be shortly silently looping behind us, helping those of you who perhaps have not yet seen the exhibition to decrypt some of its visual operations. The film revolves both theoretically and cinematically in a kind of ontological and representational vertigo around the invention of the meter and the creation of the metric system, which was a profound cognitive shift, Beny and Sasha might argue, where an abstraction supplants the human as measurement unit, and of course alongside many other more or less insidious strategies and protocols, renders the world fully quantifiable. As a rhetorical proposition, of course. And perhaps taking a cue from yesterday's keynote by Vladan Joler, it might be said that the invention of the meter inaugurates the world of the individual, which Vladan elaborated upon yesterday. So in a way, it's a negation of the negative prefix of personhood, the in of the individual, an epoch whose ecstatic consummation we're witnessing today. The invention of the meter is a crucial precursor to our boundless containment and blind transparency. The film explores three shifts in this history of standardization, from the land surveying of early modern European land privatization to the French Revolution, when the meter was actually invented, and on to the dematerialization of measurement in the contemporary era of big science and larger-than-life data aggregation. Each chapter in the film traces the relationship between epistemes of measurement and ideas of egalitarianism, agency, justice, and power. As the spatial and political consequences of the metric revolution are still unfolding today, we will discuss today connections between technologies of measurement and visual capture, the emancipation they promise, and the obscure, increasingly refined and pervasive systems of control that they encode. So on the one hand, the egalitarian rhetoric on which different episodes in the history of measurement are predicated, and the programmatic gaps which they engender. As Beny remarked in a conversation earlier, the meter is equal for all, the new system claims, but the system only functions in the absence of people, in a kind of unmanned assemblage. I'm keen to pass the microphone to the artists to introduce the film, but perhaps to zoom out a little bit, we should address the title of our conversation. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the personal equation, the ways in which it makes cinema possible, and the way in which it relates perhaps more directly to constant.
Thanks. Is that on?
Yeah, I think so. Is it on?
Oh, yeah. Hi. Thanks for coming, and thanks to IMPAKT, and thank you for this wonderful introduction. So we were thinking that in order to introduce the personal equation, it would be useful to just quickly introduce the way in which it features in the narrative of the film, and then kind of expand from there to the way that it was defined in science and to the way that it makes cinema possible, cinematic perception possible. So as you said, one of the three kind of key episodes of transition in the history of measurement that the film hinges on is the metric revolution, which was part of the same political project as the French Revolution. And those of you who have seen the film will already know this, so I'll try to be as brief as possible. But those of you who have not seen the film may or may not know the fact that a meter is defined as 1/10,000,000th of the distance between the pole and the equator. And these people we see behind us on screen represent the two astronomers that the revolutionary government had commissioned to go and measure that distance by triangulating the meridian between Dunkirk and Barcelona, establishing the curvature between them, and from that calculating the distance from the pole to the equator, from which they then calculate the meter. The motivation behind this was to create a measure that's based on a universal constant in nature, and they thought the Earth was the most, immovable, unchangeable thing. Because there was a kind of political idea behind that, that the only way to have a measure that's truly democratic and truly applies to all men as equal, you have to go somehow outside of the human realm and outside the subjective realm to the realm of nature. And so these two astronomers went on this expedition, which took them 7 years to complete, was very physically arduous. They got arrested several times. Quite an interesting story, but the thing that is relevant to kicking us off here is that the meter that we still use to this day, that was calculated during that time, then cast in platinum, and is still the basis for how the measurement systems that structure our lives work, actually contains a mistake, according to its own definition. So in many ways, the meter is just a meter insofar as it functions, but insofar as it's supposed to be 1/10,000,000th of the distance between the pole and the equator, it's not that. It's actually 2 kilometers short was their measurement that they took at the time, and for that reason, the meter is 0.2 millimeters too short. And what became clear, they could tell that their measurement was wrong because there were some inconsistencies. And what became clear, and even clearer when this phenomenon was studied half a century later in physiology, is that the reason that there was an error is because human visual perception happens in time. It's not instantaneous. And the measurement of latitude, so at Dunkirk and Barcelona, take thousands of calculations of the positions of the stars at particular times, and stars are constantly moving. And in that moment of sighting the star and noting its location, or even sighting the star and the information from the eye traveling to the brain and registering as information, time passes. And over those thousands of calculations, this discrepancy increased to become this error that remains in the meter today.
Yeah, I'll also just say thanks to everyone for coming, and it's really a pleasure to be able to talk in this context. It's worth saying that the two astronomers had really different personalities, and one of them was like, okay, who cares? It's the meter. We're going to use it. And the other, Pierre Mircan, really went crazy over this problem because he couldn't understand why it was wrong. And he went on a second expedition 7 years later, and he died on that expedition because he was so concerned with understanding what the inaccuracy was. The inaccuracy actually it would require several decades and new scientific techniques of measuring perception in the body to be able to understand this problem. They didn't have that understanding available to them. And they also, it was actually kind of through that understanding that the whole notion of scientific error became really foundational to scientific observation. And what it allows you to do when you understand that there's this time lapse between when you perceive something and when you understand it as something, is it allows you to mathematically remove the human observer from the object of observation, which is, of course, a central structure of Western science, something that we are increasingly understanding as problematic in terms of what it means to create that subject-object division. But over the kind of around the middle of the 19th century, there was a lot of investment in measuring this, and the apparatuses that were used to measure this body would eventually, as has been kind of elaborated on by many film and media historians, would become the precondition for cinematographic movement. So this lag that we have is fundamental for us to be able to perceive images cinematographically. And we don't elaborate on that story in the film because there are already kind of like enough themes to put in. But I thought here, or I guess we all thought here, this would be to kind of pick up on that thing that we didn't really fully articulate in the film and bring it into a broader discussion. And I think one of the central aspects that we kind of want to focus on here is this duality of the personal in the personal equation. That according to kind of scientific accuracy, the personal in the personal equation is the thing that needs to be eliminated. And what we want to think about is kind of reclaiming that as exactly the space of agency, exactly where there's space to operate in and defy maybe the structures of measurement.
Maybe just define personal equation.
Oh, yeah, sorry. So the personal equation is the 10th of a second that it takes between your retina receiving light, an impression of light, and it being registered in the brain. So that's roughly a 10th of a second, and it's, of course, no coincidence that the first animations were 12 frames per second. So roughly equivalent to that.
I think that's thank you so much for this comprehensive introduction to the project, and I think that's also a great segue for a first question for Ute. I'm wondering what, from the vantage point of your research and of your practice, what happens, and I do apologize if it's an unfairly broad question, but it's just a way of getting the conversation going. What happens in this gap that's produced when this correspondence between microcosm and macrocosm is disrupted, which was, in a sense, since Neoplatonism in the Renaissance, which was the central principle, ideological principle of the Western world. So there's this moment of amputation, a wound is made that is flooded by abstraction, in a sense, once measurement is placed in a supposedly external and perfectly transparent world, and the body has to, in a sense, reinvent itself, to reposition itself at the center of this world that's just inaugurated.
It works. Thanks to all of you and thanks to IMPAKT. It's been a pleasure being here. I'm a little off, I think, because those are the artists and I'm here to sort of comment on and say yes, but, and however. And we decided to be talking in a sort of conversational mode and not giving papers and everybody his points of view. But it might be a little disturbing for you to be listening to us because we've been doing this for the whole day already. No? So you need to interrupt us if that gets too among us here. I think you should. And thanks for Mihnea for sort of wrapping things very, very neatly, which I feel are more messy in my head and also in the film. The film is not messy, but you sort of, you have more but howevers than you might think now after you have listened to us. And the first thing I want to say, and then I'm coming back to what you just asked, Mihnea, is that, of course, on the one hand, measuring and taking measures as a governmentality or as a sort of new order since the French Revolution is or has been democratic, has been thought of as a democratic principle, but on the other hand it has also always been a disciplinary measure. And I just want to add to that idea of those two guys who were the slaves of measurement. I just want to add that personal equation is not that personal, because it has been measured as being 1/10 of a second or so, but also the people had to be trained to do so, because in the beginning it was much longer. And the first ones to being trained were the astrologers, who had to watch the Venus pass the sun, and then they were sort of trained to press a button to say, now it's on, and now it's on, and now it's on. And in the beginning they were too slow, and then suddenly they were accelerated. That means measuring is also a training ground. It's not just the personal equation which we all have, which was measured, but we were trained to submit to that measurement, and that's what people call the subjection to measurement. No? And that's what I think is interesting in that there is no stable measurement. In the beginning, film was 16 times 16 images per second, and then it had to be accelerated, and then nowadays it's much faster. People who are watching images today, I don't know, they had to take some sort of drugs to be able to see 16 at that time. But then again, the measurement of environment also is related to that. For instance, human beings need about 48 sort of Reize, what is that? To react to that. They need 48 images per second to sort of have a coherent world of images. However, a snail, for instance, is there a snail in the film? Not really, but other animals.
There's a fly.
There's a fly. So, Uexküll, for instance, he measured that a snail only needs 3 images per second to come up with a whole world, whereas some of the fish need hundreds to come up with a complete world. So the way we are trained to see the world also makes us perceive an environment as a complete one. No? And that changes, and that's what I find interesting. And of course now we would have to talk about the very, very fast sort of data processing, which makes our time, no? Which we don't realize. It's what some people call the unconscious. It's the matrix of our perception. And that's why it's so interesting that the topic of the whole conference should be called the discoherent. It's not called the discoherent. It's freezing, crashing. I wrote it down while it was dark, so now I can't see, I can't read it. The malfunctioning of it is the only chance that we ever get an idea that our personal equation is not personal. So I'm not answering your question really well now. But what I want to say is, it is not that we have different measurements which sort of distinguish the subject and the objective from the Renaissance, if that was what your question is. But we always have sort of measurements that are at the same time democratic and disciplinary, and there's people working in the gaps, and this is what is interesting.
Thank you so much, Uta. That's really great. I've been trying, as Uta mentioned, we've been haunted by these questions. Well, for Sasha and Beny, this is a longer process, of course, but for us, it's slightly more recent. And I've been trying to figure out what might be, not that the answer needs to be seamless and clear-cut, but what exactly is the relationship between the technological formations that are discussed in the film and the proposition of the festival. And I was looking at the logo, which in a sense looks like a motion capture studio that's been warped into a lens or into an emptily staring eye, in a sense, and wondering how the technological failure and triumph, in a sense, that's because from the failure of the meter comes cinema, in a sense, and this beast that keeps re-engendering itself while discovering its own errors and not really correcting them, but allowing them to proliferate and to eventually create a world, in a sense, out of its kind of pockets of opacity, in a sense. So what the relationship is between the technological failures and triumphs that are narrated in the film and the proposition of the festival. We're probably not going to be able to resolve this question fully, but if you have any response to the gap, perhaps, or the intersection between the curse of smooth operations and the relationship to technology and clarity and success and efficiency that's dramatized in the film.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting. I'm holding on to your saying that the problems never are answered. Like we just move forward, and the problem of Facebook was never solved, and now we just have TikTok, or it just keeps. The problem of TV was never solved, you know, but it's still around as well with all of its unsolved problems, and we just keep kind of like building on, which is also very much like what a life is like. I think you have problems that preoccupy you when you're 20 and you don't understand them, and then it's kind of the way that things shifts means that they don't. You have new problems that are more important. I think there's. If I understood what Uta was saying, early on, what you were saying is that the subject has to be trained metrically to be able to understand, right? To be able to respond in certain ways, and that's something I think we very much deal with. And maybe what was important in terms of showing a historical evolution of measurement is that this thing that is used to mediate the world, to make it more comprehensible to us, changes its physical structure. And so in the pursuit of creating a clear definition between subject and object, which you rightly, I think, say that's actually never existent. There's a continuum, and the meter creates, you know, the structure creates a continuum. I think the recognition of, so, I mean, it matters immensely how we understand things, because that creates the chain reaction that we make things within. If you're convinced that there's a clear division between subjects and objects, you make things based on that. Everything reaffirms that position. For us, I think we're very interested in exactly understanding that continuum, and understanding filmmaking not as a kind of creation of objects, or not as a description of something that's stable in the world, but as a way of inhabiting the world in a certain way. And you know, one of the things that we were really inspired by through your writing is the description, on the one hand, understanding the scientific structures that and structures of subjugation, let's say, through which cinema emerged, but then on the other hand, articulating these figures. I guess you know, you particularly dealt with Mihnea, with Vertov, with Jean Rouge, people who disrupted that in some kind of way, disrupted the logic of that in some kind of way. And I think the thing about film about moving image, because it has such a relationship to world building, that every moving image has the possibility to restructure the world according to its own terms. And that's what makes kind of like an underlying relationship to the problem of capture and movement important, I think, you know, because it creates more possibility to create a world on your own terms, maybe.
Can I just quickly? The BC thing about cinema is you don't have the continuum and you have the disrupted, but it is the rhythm that creates the imaginary continuum, no? And that's the difficulty, because you always have the two levels, as we were talking about yesterday. You have the matrix where the data are processed, and they have their own time too, which is much faster. And because of those rhythms, we sort of generate our own imaginary, and somewhere in between is that what Mihnea mentioned this morning, and which was also mentioned before by Oksana. You have a strange structure of desire. You don't know where it comes from. It sort of relates you to everything else. It makes you wander through the world and take the measure of a meter and then take off again. It makes you go to that vault where you have been, to find where the meter really is, or who's measuring and who's guarding it. You have all this mythical stuff, and really you are never, and then at the same time we have to go back to the measurement of rhythms, of the processing, of the procedures. And those double things need a very good description to be able to get back to agency, and not sort of drift off in that imaginary desire kind of balloon world. Somebody yesterday asked a very good question. What kind of description, what kind of allegories do we need to be able to have agency? And I think this is what is also at stake in your film.
I wanted to say something that responds to your question and to what you said, but the last thing you said also cues into this perfectly well. So I'll try to bring that together. But in relation to the curse of smooth operations, what we found when we looked at histories of measurement, you know, like written accounts of it, very frequently it's approached from the perspective of ever-increasing precision, as though that in itself is an undeniable good. So it's a history of, you know, smoother operations. And what we wanted to do in the film is to consider the extremely contingent, technologically but also politically, conditions that led to every one of those changes that, you know, arguably also adds precision in a way that makes things, you know, space travel possible, or all these complex operations that require really precise measurements. But we wanted to look at the kind of back end of all of those things and what kind of conceptions of the world were brought to the table in generating them. And exactly chart that same history, not from the point of view of increasing smoothness and precision being an obviously desirable thing. And maybe from what you ended on in relation to movement and capture and rhythm and maybe like duration as well, like one kind of thing that maybe can also get us to talk about some of these images is half of the film is made out of these images that were made photogrammetrically and then constructed into these point cloud environments and then animated. And we did it in quite a DIY way. And what we found is that both at the point of capture, or rather at the point of capture, the relationship between a duration and a moment was very complex. And this is really perfect timing. But as you can see in the field, the corn appears in this kind of ghostly way because it took several minutes of thousands of photographs from a drone to scan the field, in which time the corn is moving. And it creates this kind of static image that is then animated in motion. But it creates a static image that contains a multiplicity of different temporal moments within itself. And the primary function of these kinds of images are actually as measurements, not as images. And that function fails when you're confronted with an organic material that is just behaving exactly according to its own logic and to the environmental conditions, and therefore escapes capture. And that kind of place of agency and organic life, capture and duration, was somehow like a big theme for us. And it's something that became a big thing for us through trying to do this. So in a way, it's one of those instances where an image, trying to make an image, starts a kind of conceptual thought rather than the other way around.
Or if I may, like, I think that there's it starts, but it also so maybe it's worth describing briefly where that story came, like this image, how it was constructed through the process of writing this script. We ended up taking the story out of that, and because of certain formal reasons in the writing process. But it's maybe kind of interesting to explain how we arrived at that exact image. We were one of the histories that we read was by a Polish economic historian who had over his career over and over found interesting things related to measurement, and he didn't see like a comprehensive history of measurement, and he decided to do that late in his career. And he had kind of like a Marxist background, and so he wrote basically a Marxist materialist history of measurement, and he did a lot of archival research in Eastern Europe and especially in Poland about the role of measurement in medieval and early modern Eastern Europe. And there's a whole chapter where he describes quite a lot of popular superstitions that were transmitted through folklore and different kind of folk stories. And there's an interesting kind of commonality between them, which is that so there's this kind of fear of measurement. One example is like if you measure the cloth that you cut to make a child's shirt before they're 8 years old, the child will stop growing. Or if you measure precisely the harvest from the field, next year you'll have a bad harvest. If you measure a lot around medicine, there were a lot of superstitions around medicine. So, like if you went to the apothecary and you didn't want the medicine with any kind of measurement, and there's something we found that kind of so interesting because we metricize people understand that as superstitious. There's no logical relationship between these things. But if you think about the broader context in which they were happening, these people were their whole world was constantly being redefined through new measurement systems that were being imposed from the outside. So the whole relationship to their land and their labor would suddenly be gone, and they had to adapt to something else. And usually that adaptation involved a loss on their part. So suddenly their land isn't measured based on the labor time that they put in it. It's measured as just pure spatial abstracted coordinates. They have to work longer for less returns. So what emerges when you look at those superstitions from the broader context, they were a form of cognitive dissonance. They were a form of resisting this larger structure and understanding being able to transmit a form of knowledge that tells you and your neighbor, watch out for that. That guy is not your friend who comes with the measuring stick. Like, you know, like, of course, Kafka, right? The land surveyor, you know, in the, right? Like this really actually perfectly describes this kind of anonymous person who shows up in a town and he needs to measure their land. Like, there's something, surely something is wrong with that. And so that we had a story that isn't our, kind of unfortunately now that I tell it, it's kind of like a good story, so it's not in the script, but that's how that image came to be. So this is a early modern Polish peasant who is left with one ear of corn after the land surveyor is done with him. But that relationship was also really interesting, is that like all of the superstitions had to do with stasis, the arrestment of growth, the killing of life, the staying in one state, like this idea, the constant that is the precondition for scientific observation is the thing that ends life, and you know, so then we had some. I mean, of course, this wasn't figured out when we started, but that was a story we wanted to tell, and that story led to the production of that image. And of course, we had no idea how photogrammetry worked. We had no idea that we were going to get these weird things. We didn't understand that we were going to get this very imperfect image. But then that had so many repercussions to this, actually, you know, this tension between movement and stasis that these images actually capture. And I think maybe that can lead in some way, in terms of this process, in some very loosely defined understanding of cybernetics, I think our working process is very cybernetic in a lot of ways. I mean, maybe that kind of sequence of events describes that in some way. So we start with something, it does something else in the world, comes back to us, and we do something else with it, and there's this constant feedback loop.
I'd like to talk about two things, and the one is the photogrammetry, because there you have that difference between the stable objects that can be shown quite well, like in that other picture was going to come just now, the architecture, and then you have the natural things which don't work because they don't translate so well into polygons, which actually that new form of photogrammetry does. And we were just talking about that photogrammetry is from the 19th century. You might know it from the long stories of Harun Faraki's films, where he talks about Meidenbauer, a guy who was responsible of restoring architecture, but also, and that's where he developed it. Oh, and he was kind of drawing a dome, the facade of a dome, and he nearly crashed. This is what we're talking about here. He nearly crashed, so he said he's going to find out a means of cartography which doesn't involve the body. So this is where you come in, I think. Where's the body, where's the cartography? And photogrammetry is a way to do that, and Meidenbauer did that for the German imperialist project, which was called railway, to build the railway infrastructure. Now, to go back to what you did, you're using photogrammetry on the one hand, and on the other hand, optics, rather extreme optics, like the fisheye thing. Maybe you could talk about this a little bit, because in the 19th century we have optics and metrics, we have physiology as motion capture, and the neurons, the neurology, the nerves, sort of perception side. But what do you mean by taking in the fisheye? This is one point I didn't really get.
So these images, they're shot, actually it's not fisheye, but it's a 360-degree camera.
The one with the tree also, okay.
Mm-hmm.
All of the...
And so it's actually just this very small object with a 180-degree lens on either side that records simultaneously, and then you later stitch that together computationally. And it effectively creates a completely spherical image from which you could make work that can be seen in VR, where you can move around it, or you can translate that into a flat space but be able to manipulate space and perspective in such a way that almost entire 360 degrees can fit in a flat environment. And that's how these images, not these images, but those images get the way that they are. With that as well, there was something, so initially we were drawn to do it for, I guess, two reasons. One is a bit more respectable, which is that we thought, you know, spherical Earth, spherical image, there's a conceptual link. But the other one was that, you know, we were about to shoot with these dudes in like wigs. And we were like, how is, like, what if it looks really bad? We need to try to avoid realism at all costs and try to go completely the other way towards like the technological, to make a really clear kind of counterpoint between period costume and them. And so that's kind of how it came about. But then when we were actually working with it, it's the strangest, it's completely upends what it is to film something, because there's no behind the camera. Everything is in front of the camera. And so all these shots that you see there, we had to go and hide behind some trees. And then the actors have the camera on the stick, traversing the environment in our absence. And we can't really see what exactly it is until the whole thing is over. And then working with the images and understanding how they're actually produced and how they're made, we realized that the way that the kind of spherical image is created and stitched together is by computationally eliminating the central point, so where the camera itself is, and also kind of the immediate kind of underneath of it where it's held, that is removed from the image mathematically. It estimates what would be there, and through calculation eliminates the kind of observing position, which in that case is a mechanical object. But in any case, it really kind of sparked our interest insofar as this kind of disjuncture between it successfully mathematically eradicating the observer and how we were using it to tell the story of Pierre Mircan, the astronomer, subjective position being permanently embedded in the meter and not eradicated. And so that was another kind of example of learning of a kind of conceptual link through using a certain technology to make images.
There was a beautiful simultaneity, because right at that moment when you were describing the difficulties and the constraints of the 360-degree camera, we were actually looking at the photogrammetry footage, and the image or the supposed camera was actually going through the body of the peasant. The body was itself obscured in that moment to the same extent that the camera disappears itself in the process of 360-degree filming. I think, I mean, now is a good time, I think, to return to this cautiously introduced notion, which I wonder if it's interesting for you at all, of vertigo, which I quickly mentioned in the introduction. Here it feels as if the film submits wholly to the kind of dizziness and disorientation that it's been desperately trying to avoid up to this point. So it's been building this almost like performative walls of scientific insulation from the possibility of losing its bearings completely. And at the equator, it does submit fully to the temptation of a flight, of a visual movement without coordinates. It feels as if a newer camera has been absorbed into the body of an older camera, and it feels as if, like a digital, let's say a digital camera has been placed inside a film camera and is gently kind of digitally unspooling within an older machine. So there's a moment of conflation between technologies, as much as it is a moment when this micro world of the 360-degree camera encounters the other, realer world, the macro world that is in a sense emblematized by the equator. So I wonder if, as a preamble perhaps to a more interesting answer, was vertigo a sense of vertigo, a sense of disorientation, and not I guess, sorry, this is too long, but it's less the vertigo of falling and more the vertigo of gliding. It's a kind of lateral vertigo rather than a horizontal one.
Yeah, that's great. That's really a nice description. Yeah, like bringing how did you bringing an analog camera into a digital world? I can't remember. Like, yeah. Well, I think because there's actually a funny, very subtle, probably impossible to. I mean, I guess we weren't trying to make it a known reference, but there is actually the images that you were referring to that are spinning in that way are taken from Google Earth. We found some kind of like open source software where you can get the whole 360-degree image from any Google Earth coordinate, and then because we were using this software plugin to work with 360 images where you can move through all the coordinates, we could bring those images in and then on our own terms move through them. And it's rotating on 2 axes, which does have this reference to La Région Centrale, is that? Yeah. So it's actually the Michael Snow, yeah, so it's actually doing exactly the same movement, but I mean, it's not so important, but of course there's like millions of these little hidden things that guide us in one way or another. Yeah, the vertigo, I think the gliding and the vertigo, it's so nice to hear as a description, I think, because it's something that is a byproduct of chain reaction of putting things together for certain intentions, and then something else comes out, and I think what we were, if there's a vertigo, it's a kind of it's a looking at a fundamental uncertainty about the structure of the world that we are really invested in exploring, I think, and exploring cinematically. And I mean, maybe, I don't know, I could maybe drift off, but maybe it's maybe interesting to describe what's going on. Like, for example, in this shot, which is a reconstruction of a meeting that we had with the National Physics Laboratory, which is the UK authority for measurement standardization, which is part of a larger global organization that work together to define every measurement of anything. Yeah, the whole, yeah. They just measure everything, and they are the historical outcome of these processes. And our initial idea was to film in their facilities, and as we describe in the film, that was a long, arduous process, at the end of which we were denied access. And so this whole scene, which was incredibly laborious and painstaking to make, was a one-liner joke, came from, after this rejection email by the PR person in this extremely kind of commercial language, like thanking us for the opportunity and wishing us the best with our opportunities in the future. There was this moment of frustration, and then being like, okay, well, everything is measured, so like let's make our own film that's not reliant on them. And so there's like a structure that's I think we see parts of each of the 3 sections. So I think there was like this other formal strand that was occupying us, which was the circle of the globe, and then the circle of the atom, and this shift that happens with the switch to atomic constants, and this kind of constant oscillation between interior and exterior, and being inside the measurement headquarters, but being denied access, but then the person inside doesn't know anything about measurement, and that's the person responsible for, the PR person has no idea about what's going on there. It's just this PR person, and then this gesture there. If you've seen the film, there's a line where one of the scientists we're talking to refers to the PR person as the thought police. This was real. This was what happened in the meeting, and it was such a surreal moment for us because we were asking to get access to this place, and suddenly this scientist who's very friendly and very much wants us to come and film, and is very much kind of charmed that we're interested in this thing. There's a line in the script as well where it's like, it's like the most boring thing in the world. Like no one has ever thought his job was interesting, and we're there like, oh, can we please like film, and he's charmed by that, like really, and kind of on our side, and then it is very very much needs us to know that this person, he's not connected to him. This PR person who's going to be like responsible, decide whether it's commercially viable to have us in. And that was such a surreal moment because it's like, where's the inside, where's the outside, where's the organizing power? How, and what it meant for us is that it said something greater about where power is distributed today. And there was a story of measurement, kind of coming from the sovereign's foot, like the king owns measurement, to it's this object in the world that is guarded with a vault, to a theoretical idea of it being open, but being so complex that no one without specialist training can know what it is. And then if you do have specialist training, it's so specialized that you don't know what the bigger picture is. And so we wanted to really deal with this inside and outside. And so what you see with the 3 different sections that the office comes in is the first scene happens where everyone is inside the office, the camera is in the central position, and you see it from the inside. You don't yet know that this is a total abstraction. You could be in a real office. And in the second scene, we see that this is floating in a void. And in the third scene, everyone is outside of the office. So where it's kind of revealed that we're not going to have access and that no one occupies the room. And maybe that has something to do, I think for us, maybe to go back, a long-winded return to the issue of vertigo, that was a vertiginous moment. It was like, why are we in this room? And why are you telling us that you've finally perfectly democratized the system, but we can't see anything that's going on? And that was vertiginous.
I just wanted to add something. I mean, why are those guys afraid is maybe too much to say, but why are they suspicious? And it is exactly because cinema comes from a measuring tradition. So the camera is maintaining that it is a huger measuring device than the physics, because, as I said, it includes the neurology and the physiology, and it includes the data collection systems, as you're using digital systems now and mathematical measuring. So I think that this is where my question of agency comes in. We said we're not going to use the word responsibility, but we're going to use the word agency. Where's agency coming in if you're filming and you're pretending that you are still an observer while you are the subject or while you are the user of, again, huge mathematical systems which you don't even know how they work. I mean, of course you can use them, but you don't know the algorithms, and you're buying them, and you look into Google World and all that kind of thing. So we need to get clear about at what point in that system where there is no ubiquitous knowledge are we sort of philosophizing, or are we judging, or are we sort of making a difference what's democratic and what is disciplinary? Who is owning the algorithms and who is suffering from the extraction of the algorithm? Nah, that kind of thing. And if we are making films, we need to at the same time use them and criticize them, and that makes our job so difficult.
I think just one thing that there's no single world, I think, is such an important thing, and that to enter into this space that is actually not surveyable by any person, and that really has no authority. And I think that's a kind of crisis. Maybe that's the that's like the anxiety around being filmed, and how they represent themselves, because they need to maintain that they have some kind of ontological claim on reality. If the measurement fortress doesn't know what's what, then it's like, we've lost everything. And then just one thing about that kind of, like, there's this moment with the caveman, like at the beginning, and that's something that seems so out of place in that environment. And it's something that can't, like, that conversation happened, like again, like as Sasha was saying, this idea, she brings it up as, the scientist brings it up as this kind of like, here's this linear, there was a caveman and he had a stick and now we measure atoms. Like that there's just this clear, like, linear progression. But it's like I think it's something that was really important, I think, for us in our process in this film, and that is very much guiding our new film, is like that trusting to insert that idiosyncrasy into things. Do you know what I mean? Like to say, like, this isn't the world as such, this is the very random particularity of the world we encountered. And, sorry,
What?
You should talk now.
Oh.
I'm sorry, I don't know what we should do about time, which seems to have slipped away. We should?
Oh, okay.
Okay, great, yeah, thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, just to add to what you said, their whole deal at the NPL is precisely to have an ontological claim on reality. But in being observed to do their work, that as such would reveal the fact that it's an epistemological operation that they're undertaking. And it can only ever be that. But that's completely at odds with how they understand it. And when we try to talk to them about, I mean, that's also in the film, the kind of, as a joke, sort of, but the way that they're kind of understood that, all the things that you would need to measure a meter, not everyone has. And still they were just like, they wouldn't let it go. They're just like, it's a thing in the world, it's fair for everyone, it's fine. But in relation to cinema, also to elaborate on what you said, but you used the word observation, and I think that's why people find the camera threatening as well, because there's this idea that it's going to somehow create, I don't know, evidence, or somehow transfer things that are stable in the world and can be stably recorded, and then someone encountering the recording would somehow have access to the thing. Or even worse, maybe that it would be somehow manipulated in a way to skew what the real condition of the thing is. But the way that we approach making films is not really from the point of view of observation, because we don't think the world is a stable thing. So we approach it from the position of, I guess, like, image making is one way to look at it, but also like learning and intervention as well. And so it's engaging with the world and with the tools, with some kind of images in mind that don't exist in the world, but where the world inevitably intervenes. It's like we want to stage a collaboration between our intentions, such as they may be, the way that the technological tools are going to behave, regardless of what we're trying to do with them, and then the way that a given environment or person is going to be at that moment. And that's not an observation moment, because we're not in an observing subject position in that kind of straightforward way.
I don't want to interrupt the flow of the conversation, but I also want to open to questions from the audience, if there is one. Should I throw you this?
Thank you. Yeah, I thought it was very interesting what you said, Sasha, about how you came to this idea with this 360-degree camera. Also, I mean, it was also very generous of you to share how that came to be, because I think it's something I recognize in my own work, that this kind of justification, the best justification always comes too late somehow. So that, because those two reasons you mentioned first are not at all as interesting as the one you came to in the end, where you actually, the exclusion of the position of the camera is really the perfect reasoning, perfect, but the good reasoning, like to use that particular imagery. But I was also thinking about how that relates to Sasha's work, because in Sasha Formwald's work, which you can see in the same exhibition, it's what you don't see there is not a human subject, so to say, but the exclusion, like the fact that that analog film is made out of gelatin. Is that you don't see the animal there but it's another, like, it's just interesting to think about, because there it's the exclusion of something dead, whereas in your film it's exclusion of something living, I guess. And I don't know, I just wonder if you can reflect on that. Or
I mean, I think both of our approaches are trying to forge a kind of continuum. So there's a way in which either a process or the material qualities of something restore some kind of continuity in the world. I mean, I guess, you know, like Walter Benjamin understood film to potentially have this healing property for capitalist alienation, that you could create a proximity to things that would like restore something fundamental that had been cut up. And in a lot of ways, I think, you know, that's a big continuous strand in experimental film, is to deal always with the...
But you show the continuum then by not showing something, or I mean, if something is excluded and you show the exclusion itself, but because in Zachary's work, for instance, you cannot show this animal because it's just impossible. We couldn't see the image without having the material, you know. So it's not it's a strange continuum because it's somehow created through a discontinuity, right? Or?
Can I just, because I think you're completely right, and I think the problem is that Walter Benjamin didn't only talk about healing, but he is always talking about the edge. Either it's barbarism or it's going to be communism. But he never said there's any chance of things to get better. But it's an allegoric thinking we are on the edge and we have to make decisions. And like it's us.
Optimistic reading, maybe?
Yes, far too optimistic. That was in 36. There's no reason to be optimistic at that time. But I think the difficulty is, as I said, to work with a medium and at the same time to be able to see what the cost of that medium is, as in Zachary's work. We need to have the gelatine to at all see the surface of that strange pond with its history, and at the same time we need to know that it is a circle of death which is going. And the difficulty is, I think, in working with any medium, is to make cuts and to not have it run smoothly and to see where it breaks and where the breakdowns are. And at that point, not only get an idea of the imaginary, as I said, but our own position in that kind of procedures. That's what makes those things interesting. No? That we are part of it and we cannot get out. It is not that we can say, oh, but we need to use the social media because otherwise we don't get ahead in our careers. Yes, but it's other people who are paying the price for that. And that is something that you are suggesting, I think, with the topic of that impact thing. That we are not artists or philosophers or people like that, but we're producers of that deathly circle, and that's something we need to ask ourselves. What do we do in that situation?
I think I also would add to, I guess in response to your question, that I think it's often, things are often looked at as though there is a binary between concealing and revealing something, and there's certain, practices that might be about, revealing the not commonly known cost of this or that, But I think we really want to think kind of beyond that boundary and just something else, like something that's not on that particular continuum. And, you know, it can be intervening, it can be breaking, it can be, you know, doing something just like on a different plane. So it's not just about being like, see, it's fine, it's no longer opaque, and you know how it's made, but doing something with that.
Yes, thanks. This is a really fascinating conversation. I like the way that to understand the genealogy of this this mistake that you talk about, that like they encountered when they were going to make these measurements. I suppose that is also like followed by quantum mechanics in a way, like what is it called, the many worlds interpretation, where it's stated that you can never measure properly the physical object anyways, because it's no longer what it was at the moment that you tried to encounter it. And then when you have, I guess, recorded it. But I think that it's a little bit unfortunate in a way that both of these discoveries are like given these like physical and biological properties, when there is like a parallel already in a theoretical sense. If you think in the phenomenology of spirit, in Hegel's like foreword, he talks about the sense certainty, like the impossibility of sense certainty. And because that, I think, already, like what the unfortunate thing about like transposing this into like biological and physical measurements, really, of like why, it obscures to us, I think, a gap or like a split that is already like in subjectivity, and it doesn't allow us to assume that position. I find, I was just like as a comment to like, if you anyways think that you need to get closer and closer and closer to understanding why it's impossible to really measure and understanding some kind of oppression about measurements. Yeah, I guess I'm saying the same thing, but it's unfortunate that can't
so
have
I guess
theory.
I guess I don't think that we're saying it's impossible to measure. Measurement works perfectly. Like everything about my voice being transmitted to you is because of very well-functioning measurements.
But there's a split. There's like a remove from what is. Yeah.
I think the point is that measurement produces the world through its own lens. It produces, and that it's not. So I mean, from the very little I understand about quantum physics, which is like having read Karen Braun, is that it's, that there's the main takeaway is that phenomena in the world change depending on how you look at them. The structure that you look at them defines how they appear to you, which is, huge. It's kind of amazing that comes from the forefront of the Western scientific system. So it's after, 300 years of kind of denying that, or trying as hard as it can to deny that, suddenly reaches this point where that's not feasible according even to its own logic. That's my kind of very non-expert takeaway. But so the point isn't that measurement doesn't work. I think but just that there is something outside of measurement, and that there is also a lot of intention and a lot of very deliberate kind of structure around what seems to be present, I guess.
Any further questions?
Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I had a moment while I was watching it in the booth where, and I don't know if this was something intentional or just some sort of technological interruption, but there was a moment of a glitch that happened, and I don't know if that was an intentionally, determined choice, but the sound cut out, or the image almost started breaking down, and I wasn't sure if this was a kind of an intentional like aesthetics of the glitch, because I think that that's kind of a key part of this whole thing, that these two astronomers really just like composed or integrated this glitch into what is now considered to be like a standard global procedure. So I was wondering if that was something intentional, or if you considered this kind of glitch aesthetic in your own production of the video, or kind of what role do you see the glitch having when we talk about film and this
We
form
need to
of
talk
media?
to Bram.
Yeah, that was something wrong with the technology in this.
It worked perfectly for me. So.
But this, but this is like one big glitch that we're looking at here. So exactly these things, trying to kind of visually mediate the things that escape technological precision was certainly something that we intentionally wanted to do. But that is an unfortunate.
No, I didn't find it unfortunate at all. I found it actually like very much thematically fit. And it was also in this transition period between these kind of photogrammatic renderings and then another scene. I can't remember exactly where it was placed, but there was two moments.
Like a strobing?
Like a slight bit of like an interruption of the sound and a bit of like a strobing effect in the image. Yeah. But it was still fascinating in the sense that it actually quite, like, and in and of itself, that is part of kind of like, I think, the logic of the glitch, is that it appears in these uncalculable.
Well, I mean, that's it. Listen, insofar as we're making it, we're collaborating with the cameras, but insofar as you're able to watch it, suddenly the projector has all the agency. And, we were told this projector shakes because the train's going by. And so your visual experience includes the train.
Yeah, yeah.
There's an amazing like Flusser quote where he talks about like observing people in the cinema and how angry they get when the machine stops operating. They have to be confronted with this illusion.
Yeah, the disruption. No, yeah. It was...
I mean, and I don't know if you guys had a lot of like Zoom calls during the pandemic that like got cut off. It's really, especially at the darkest point of it was. My whole reality happened in the space of that internet connection. And I had to give a presentation once where it cut off exactly at this, and I felt it in my nervous system, like the interruption, it was so ingrained in that.
Thank you. Your film is about the metric system, and I think also about how such a system can be a tool in the execution of political power. Maybe you can expand a bit on that, how you see that, and also in relation to, that other system, which is actually called the imperial system. Why specifically did you look for these political implications in the metric system, and what can you tell a bit more about that?
I guess I wouldn't say the film is about the metric system insofar as it's about the politics of measurement, and it's just like one very key episode in that history where a really standard measurement was quantified specifically on the basis of seeking out things in the physical world to base them on, which was very different to everything that preceded it, and that was really explicitly part of a political project. But we kind of often have thought of the film with these kind of three measurement transitions being related to three modes of power, anyway, with in the first instance, sovereign top-down power, and this issue of the transition to measuring land by surface area, which, people at the time, it seems so natural to us now, but people at the time couldn't conceptualize how that would be useful or how it represented what the land is. And then this kind of departure from sovereign power towards an imaginary of a democratic state, and this desire to create a measure that is somehow inhuman and therefore could represent all humans equally, which is in itself a kind of paradox that we were fascinated by. And then, finally, in this kind of contemporary moment, with this situation and this institution where, the vertigo was precisely that, no one has the keys to the vault, as we say in the film, but no one has power. It's not concentrated in any one place that can somehow have a clear plan that's then communicated. And that's really true of the contemporary world in general, in that, and that's kind of where I find conspiracy theories come from, is the inability to deal with chaos and the need to ascribe some kind of like power center that has agency. Yeah. Because it's much harder to deal with the fact that no one actually has agency.
Or that all of us have agency. Right. I mean, I was really surprised when with the first lockdown and there were no airplanes flying, and suddenly in Europe they were able to keep the CO2 level down. I mean, something really happened, which I should never have thought possible. And those kinds of possibilities are, maybe they are hopeful glitches that happen, but we need to be aware of that too, not only of the disasters, which are probably more spectacular to tell.
Echoing perhaps the last question, I was very struck earlier today when you, Beny, spoke about this strange complicity, at least in terms of historiography, in terms of concomitance between the metric system being now based on atomic constants and the financial system no longer being based on the gold standard. So there's a strange equivalence that happens, you said roughly simultaneously, when the gold standard becomes in a sense the equivalent of that platinum meter that's stored in a vault, like a monument to the revolution, to a revolution that didn't actually build monuments in the traditional sense, but still conserved that monumental desire that's embodied in this platinum meter. So moving away from the physical meter into an atomic one, although atoms are physical as well, and moving away from the gold standard in finance, happening at roughly the same time in the 80s as a means to go beyond measurement in your project.
Yeah, I think it's early 70s, and and it happens roughly within the.
Oh, it's Nixon. It's Nixon who announced.
Yeah. So, yeah, and I think the 7 SI, these are really complex systems that are happening in decentralized ways. So people have, measurements had started shifting into more and more complexity, but it was important to create a universal system, which is the 7 SI units that are now the kind of the central standardization of all different kinds of measurement, and that was dematerialized, I think, within 2 years. I can't remember the exact date, but it was like within 2 years of the gold standard. It was kind of such a big theme that we didn't go much further down thinking about that. But I think, yeah, I mean, of course, there's a central paradox as well in each, and that does in a way mirror the problem of power and democratization that keeps happening in each transition, which is understanding how the definition of concrete and abstract changes over time. For a lot of people, the body, your own physical body, is the most concrete thing about your experience, and so it makes sense that you would derive your measurement systems from body parts, and that you and through the various developments of Western science, we have learned to understand that as the most fallible thing, and the shifts in the metric system, or in the different measurement standardization systems, reflect exactly that complete reversal of what we take to be abstract and concrete.
Well, I think we've been by another branch of recent science, and this I think will be expressed quite with plenitude in your next film. Medicine and anatomy have dispossessed us of our own bodies to an extent which, as we know, bear our own imprint to a very small percentage, to a very small extent.
I mean, we have a friend who got an MRI in Finland, and she's trying to get them to the UK. She's trying to get the results to the UK, and it's impossible. She can't get them through the different systems, and it's like it's her own body's, the data that is going also to be vital, and she can't get like an appointment to get an MRI in the UK because of the NHS, and time is up. Yeah. But it's a perfect example of, it's like this really concrete example of how we are dispossessed of our own bodies. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this brilliant responses. Thank you so much for your questions and your patience. Thanks all.
Thank you.